Ava Carter walked onto the airplane with quiet confidence, turning only a few heads as she passed. She wore a tailored blazer over a sleek black dress, her natural curls framing her face. In one hand, she held a leather laptop bag, while in the other, her boarding pass was neatly folded. As she made her way down the aisle, her eyes flicked to the seat numbers, scanning for hers. Her demeanor was calm, composed, and yet there was an undeniable sense of determination about her. When she reached her seat in first class, Ava smiled politely at the passenger next to her and placed her bag in the overhead compartment. She sat down and pulled out a small notebook and pen, beginning to jot down a few notes, completely unaware of the curious glances from the other passengers. Her focus was entirely on her work, embothered by the occasional sideways looks. Miranda Scott, one of the flight attendants, moved briskly through the cabin, checking in with passengers. She wore her crisp uniform with a sharp gaze that seemed to take in everything. When her eyes landed on Ava, she paused. There was something about the woman that seemed out of place, but Miranda couldn't quite put her finger on it. She frowned, trying to reconcile the woman's presence in first class. She quickly approached Ava's seat. "Excuse me," Miranda said, her tone polite but carrying an edge. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Ava looked up, surprised, but not rattled. "Of course," she replied, handing over the boarding pass with a small smile. Miranda scanned the ticket and frowned slightly. "This is for first class?" she asked, her tone now more uncertain. "Yes, it is," Ava answered simply, her voice steady. Miranda's frown deepened, as if trying to reconcile what she saw with what she thought she knew. After a moment's hesitation, she handed the boarding pass back, her lips pressed into a tight line. She walked away without saying another word, but Ava's calm demeanor seemed to leave an impression on her, one that Miranda couldn't shake. Something felt off, though Miranda couldn't pinpoint what it was. As Miranda walked away, Ava returned to her notes, the rest of the cabin buzzing with quiet activity. She had already brushed off the brief interaction. Her calm exterior remained unbroken, and she didn't notice Miranda speaking quietly with another flight attendant nearby, casting glances back in her direction. Minutes later, Miranda returned, this time with a more authoritative air. She stood by Ava's seat and spoke in a tone that was no longer just polite, but insistent. "Miss Carter, could you step aside for a moment?" Miranda asked, her voice now carrying a hint of firmness. "I need to verify something." Ava blinked in surprise, but remained calm. She stood, took her laptop bag, and followed Miranda toward the galley. As they walked down the aisle, the passengers in first class exchanged curious looks, some whispering under their breath. Ava's poise remained intact, though she could sense the rising tension around her. When they reached the narrow space of the galley, Miranda spoke again. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat," Miranda said, folding her arms. "It seems there may have been a mistake with your booking." Ava raised an eyebrow, a slight frown crossing her face. "A mistake? I don't think so. I booked this ticket weeks ago, and it was confirmed." Miranda's tone turned colder. "I've already checked. I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. You'll have to take a seat in the main cabin." Ava's expression shifted, disbelief flashing across her features for just a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't understand. My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Miranda stiffened, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move, or I'll have to call security to assist." Ava's eyes narrowed, but she nodded once, quietly returning to her seat to gather her things. The entire cabin was watching now, murmurs growing louder as Ava walked toward the back of the plane, escorted by Miranda. The tension was palpable, but Ava kept her head high. When they reached the main cabin, Miranda gestured toward an empty seat in the middle row. Ava placed her bag under the seat and sat down without a word. Miranda walked away, leaving Ava to settle into her new, much less comfortable spot. Ava looked out the window, her face calm, but her thoughts clearly racing. Somewhere between frustration and disbelief, Ava reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and typed a quick message. When she hit send, A knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, but the tension in the air around Ava was palpable. She sat quietly in her new seat, her expression unreadable. A few passengers cast sympathetic glances her way, while others quickly turned away, pretending not to notice. Ava ignored them all, focusing instead on the screen of her phone. The smile never left her lips, but it wasn't for anyone else to see. As the flight continued, the atmosphere on board grew heavier. Miranda kept moving through the cabin, performing her duties with practiced ease, but her thoughts were never far from Ava. There was something about the way the woman had handled the situation that had unsettled her. Ava's calmness was unnerving, like she was playing a game Miranda didn't fully understand. A few minutes after the interaction, Miranda received a call on her in-flight phone. She picked it up, her stomach tightening as she heard the voice on the other end. "This is the executive office." The voice said, "We've received a complaint about an incident with a first-class passenger. You need to provide a full report upon landing." Miranda's pulse quickened. She thought back to her earlier interaction with Ava. She had only followed her gut instinct, but now it seemed that something bigger was at play. Ava, as it turned out, wasn't just any passenger. The voice on the phone made it clear that Ava Carter was connected to the airline's board of directors. Miranda's heart sank as she realized the depth of her mistake. She had acted rashly, assuming that Ava didn't belong in first class. She had no idea that she had just crossed someone who could make her career come to a grinding halt. In the main cabin, Ava sat quietly, oblivious to Miranda's growing unease. She had already put her plan into motion. As she glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by, her calm exterior betrayed nothing of what was truly happening beneath the surface. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, as though each moment was part of a larger, carefully crafted strategy. She pulled out her phone again and sent a message. "They'll call soon. Let me know when it's done," it read. A small smile tugged at her lips as she hit send. Meanwhile, Miranda felt the tension growing within her as she walked down the aisle. The passengers in first class seemed to be watching her with increased interest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. She glanced at the young flight attendant, Clara, who had been helping passengers in the main cabin. Clara approached Ava with a kindness that contrasted sharply with Miranda's earlier harshness. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Claire asked softly, her eyes filled with genuine concern. Ava looked up at her, offering a warm smile. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a bit of a mix-up, I suppose." Clara hesitated for a moment, clearly sensing that there was more to the story. But Ava's composed demeanor discouraged further questions. She placed a glass of water on Ava's tray and stepped away. Miranda watched from a distance, her discomfort deepening. Ava's calm interactions with Claire only served to highlight her own growing anxiety. What had started as a simple mistake now felt like a much bigger issue, one that she couldn't easily fix. As the flight continued, Miranda tried to shake off the creeping dread that lingered in her chest. She kept moving through the cabin, serving drinks and checking on passengers. But every time she glanced at Ava, she felt a growing sense of unease. Ava remained calm, her focus on her notebook as she jotted down notes, completely unfazed by the tension around her. Minutes passed before another call came through to the galley. Miranda's breath hitched in her chest when Dennis, the senior flight attendant, handed her the phone. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "They're asking for you by name," he said, his voice low. Miranda's hands trembled slightly as she took the phone. "This is Miranda," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Miranda, this is the captain," a calm voice responded. "We've received another call from the executive office. They're aware of the situation with Ms. Ava Carter. She's a significant figure with the airline, and we've been instructed to ensure she is treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of the flight. Do you understand?" Miranda's stomach dropped as she processed the information. Her mind raced, but she could barely form a response. The realization that she had just made a major mistake settled heavily on her. "Yes, of course," she stammered, trying to mask the rising panic in her voice. The captain's voice was firm. "Ensure there are no more issues with her seating. Do not approach her again unless necessary." The call ended, and Miranda stood frozen in the galley, the weight of her actions crashing down on her. She glanced toward the main cabin, where Ava was seated calmly, as if nothing had happened. But now, Miranda knew that everything had changed. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The flight seemed to stretch on forever for Miranda. Each passing minute felt like a ticking clock, counting down to an inevitable confrontation. Despite her best efforts to continue her duties, her hands trembled, and the weight of the earlier conversation with the captain hung over her like a storm cloud. She kept moving through the cabin, but her every action felt mechanical, disconnected from the reality of the situation. Ava, on the other hand, remained unfazed. She continued to sit calmly, occasionally glancing out the window, her notebook closed on her lap. The atmosphere around her was still charged with the tension of the earlier events, but Ava's poise never faltered. To the untrained eye, she was just another first-class passenger, lost in her own world. But those who watched closely could feel the subtle power she exuded, as if she were quietly orchestrating something far beyond what anyone else on the plane could see. The hours passed, and soon, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are in their upright positions." The usual flurry of activity began as passengers prepared for landing. Miranda hurried to finish her checks, but her every movement was rigid, filled with a sense of urgency that was out of place. She avoided looking at Ava as she passed by, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was looming over her. Ava remained calm and composed, leaning back in her seat, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest. She glanced at her watch, and then at the screen displaying the flight's progress. She'd been waiting for this moment. The end of the flight wasn't just a physical destination, it was the point at which her plan would come to fruition. As the plane began its descent, Miranda made her way to the galley once again, her thoughts a whirlwind of anxiety. Dennis, who had been keeping an eye on her, noticed her nervous demeanor and approached cautiously. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. Miranda hesitated for a moment before responding, her voice tight. "I messed up, Dennis. I didn't realize who she was. I thought she didn't belong in first class." Dennis crossed his arms, his gaze sharpening. "You assumed, didn't you?" he said. "And now, look at you. This isn't just a mistake, Miranda. You crossed the wrong person. People like her, they don't forget." Miranda clenched her fists, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. She knew he was right. What started as a gut feeling had turned into a full-blown career-ending mistake. The flight attendant job she had worked so hard for now felt like a distant memory, something she had lost in a single moment of judgment. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Ava's phone buzzed. She checked the screen, reading a short message that simply said, "All set. Be ready." A small, knowing smile played on her lips as she tucked the phone away. The pieces were falling into place, and Miranda had no idea what was about to hit her. The plane landed smoothly, and the usual rustling filled the cabin as passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and retrieved their belongings. But for Miranda, the noise seemed distant, muffled, as she awaited what was inevitably coming her way. She tried to force a smile, greeting each passenger as they passed, but her heart wasn't in it. She knew that her actions were about to catch up with her as passengers disembarked. Ava remained seated, taking her time as the others filed out. She wasn't in a hurry. The situation had already been set in motion, and there was no need to rush. She gathered her things slowly, each movement precise and calculated. When she finally stood and walked toward the exit, the remaining crew exchanged glances, sensing that something significant was happening. When Ava reached the door, Miranda straightened, trying to maintain her composure. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Carter," she said, her voice softer than usual, the forced politeness evident. Ava stopped and turned to look at her. Her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied calmly, her voice carrying a weight that left Miranda feeling exposed and vulnerable. Without another word, Ava stepped off the plane, leaving Miranda standing frozen in place. The seconds stretched out, each one feeling like an eternity. Miranda could feel the eyes of the remaining crew on her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet their gaze. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in. A moment later, two uniformed security officers boarded the plane, their presence commanding immediate attention. They scanned the cabin, their eyes narrowing as they approached Miranda. "Are you Miranda Scott?" one of them asked, his voice firm and authoritative. Miranda's breath caught in her throat, and she nodded silently. The officer continued, "We need you to come with us. We have some questions regarding an incident on this flight." The color drained from Miranda's face as the reality of her situation hit her. She had gone from being a flight attendant performing her job to being the subject of an investigation. Her legs felt weak as the officers escorted her off the plane, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions. Outside the terminal, Ava stood by the gate, her phone pressed to her ear. Her expression was calm as she listened to the conversation on the other end. "The security team has taken her in for questioning," she said, her voice steady. "Make sure the board reviews the footage and statements. I want this matter resolved professionally but thoroughly." She hung up the phone and walked toward baggage claim, her steps measured and deliberate. She had done what she set out to do. It wasn't about revenge, it was about ensuring that the airline faced the consequences of its actions, and that a system of bias and discrimination would no longer go unchecked. As Ava left the airport, she glanced around at the bustling terminal. The world was moving on, but she knew that her actions today had sparked a ripple. She had already begun to change things, and as she headed toward her next meeting, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. This was just the beginning.